intellectuals are emerging from the oppressed segments of the population who not only carry over with them this sense of oppression and therefore raise their voices against it, but what is more, they also have an impact on the other students. If a person who is not a Dalit student lives with a Dalit student, then he, in a sense, gets to realize the pain and the exclusion that the Dalit student has felt all his life. So it also has an impact not only in terms of raising the voices of the oppressed segments, but also in sensitizing the non-oppressed towards the conditions of the oppressed. So publicly funded institutions have played this extremely important role, which now is under attack. And it is under attack by invoking a concept of nationalism, that basically these are anti-national institutions. Now, I want to devote some time to this discussion of nationalism because of the fact that there is an enormous amount of confusion, including on the left, I must say, on this entire issue. You see, we have to distinguish between nationalism as it evolved in Europe and nationalism as it evolved in the course of the anti-colonial struggles in a lot of the third world countries, including in India. Now, I say there's a lot of confusion on the left because the European left has continuously debunked nationalism for a particular reason, because they think of all nationalism as the same as European nationalism. And since the expression of European nationalism was always imperialist, was always, in the limit, it was fascist, it was something which was sustained by finance capital. In fact, Rudolf Hilferding, one of the Marxist economists who wrote on finance capital, said that the ideology of finance capital is a glorification of the national idea. So in Europe, nationalism has taken a particular course, and therefore the European Marxists who are opposed to that kind of nationalism think all nationalism is like that, and therefore they don't even understand third world anti-imperialist nationalism. So let me spend a bit of time discussing this issue of nationalism, and that is the following. In Europe, nationalism began in the 17th century, nationalism, nation state, and it began with the Peace of Westphalia. There were two treaties of Westphalia, which is a place in Germany, in which two peace treaties were signed, one ending the 30 Years' War and one ending the 80 Years' War that had afflicted Europe. Now, that nationalism was marked by three characteristics, each of which does not exist in the kind of anti-imperialist nationalism which took place in India. The first characteristic is that nationalism was never inclusive. It was not a nationalism which treated all the inhabitants of the nation as equals. That was a nationalism which discriminated against the Jews as the other inside the nation. In the north of Europe, it discriminated against the Catholics as the other inside the nation. In the south of Europe, it discriminated against the Protestants as being the other inside the nation, and so on. So that was never an inclusive, equal, egalitarian nationalism. First feature. The second feature of European nationalism, or the nationalism that developed in Europe, is that it was from the very beginning imperialist. In fact, you find that Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of the English Revolution in 1640, within months of the Westphalian Agreement being signed, Oliver Cromwell invaded Ireland, which was the first colony in the world. That nationalism was used to acquire an empire for yourself. The First World War was fought between the different powers, each trying to acquire or defend its economic territory in terms of its empire all over the world, and that was fought in the name of the nation. The German nation must have an empire. The British nation must have its empire. The French nation must have its empire. So that nationalism was necessarily imperialist. The third feature of that nationalism is that it saw the nation as being above the people. There was something metaphysical about the nation. There was something kind of, mythical about the nation. The nation was not reducible to the people. The nation was above the people, and the people were expected to make sacrifices for this thing called the nation. And therefore, because the nation, it was suggested, the interest of the nation demands an empire, the people must sacrifice themselves in wars. German people must sacrifice themselves in wars with France. French people must sacrifice themselves in wars against England, all because the English nation, the French nation, the German nation, which were above the people, required these empires, which were actually required by the bourgeoisie. Therefore, bourgeois nationalism of the European kind, I call it an aggrandizing nationalism, that bourgeois nationalism of the European kind basically was aggrandizing, used people as cannon fodder by projecting the nation as standing above the people. Contrast this with the anti-imperialist nationalism that developed not only in India, everywhere, India, Indonesia, it developed in Brazil, it developed elsewhere. In all these places, the nationalism that developed in the course of the anti-colonial struggle had the opposite of these three tendencies I was talking about, European nationalism. This nationalism had to be inclusive because, after all, you are fighting a big power. You can't fight a big power without uniting all the people. And if you unite all the people, you can unite them only on the basis of some kind of an equality. And therefore, there is nobody who must feel excluded. Because if anybody felt excluded, that weakens the anti-imperialist struggle. Therefore, this nationalism, from its very beginning, was an inclusive nationalism. What is more, this inclusiveness of this nationalism was not something which was actually simply asserted, simply in the air. Most of these anti-colonial national struggles actually always had a charter. They were based on a kind of social contract. In India, the Karachi Congress resolution of 1931 spelled out for the first time what post-independence India is going to look like, and that was like a charter. The constitution that later on was formed was based on that. In South Africa, the Freedom Charter, which was actually the basis of the South African armed struggle, was actually a charter. So a lot of these nationalisms were actually anti-imperialist, anti-colonial nationalisms, were inclusive, and this inclusiveness expressed itself in a charter, in a kind of contract among the people. It's as if the people came together to constitute a nation. The Karachi Congress resolution, for instance, promised one person, one vote, universal adult franchise based on one person, one vote. Now you imagine in this country, in which you have a millennia of caste oppression, to actually have universal adult franchise that elects the government based on a one person, one vote, was a major breakthrough. And that breakthrough is something which was a part of the anti-colonial struggle, and it was an expression of the inclusive nationalism. It also promised many other things. It promised equality before law, irrespective of differences in gender, language, religion, and so on. It promised a secular state, that the state must have no religion. It promised an end to capital punishment, because the Karachi Congress resolution was drafted within days of Bhagat Singh's execution, and therefore it promised an end of capital punishment. Likewise, It promised free and compulsory primary education for all. It promised that every Indian must have a minimum material standard of living, many of which have not yet been realized. But that was the notion of the Indian nation. The second feature, therefore, is that it did not see the nation as standing above the people, but the people constituted the nation. In fact, this was something very clear in the Karachi Congress resolution itself, as I said, the idea that a minimum material condition of living must be assured to every Indian, and of course Gandhiji's famous remark that tears must be wiped away from every Indian's eyes. Now that is something which actually suggested that the purpose of constituting a nation and a nation state is that the nation state must ensure that everybody has a certain minimum condition of existence, and therefore the nation was not above the people. And of course the third feature is that it was anti-imperialist. It was not supposed to be an imperial concept. In other words, the nation and the nation state were not supposed to themselves then go around aggrandizing other nations, other countries, etc. If anything, you needed the support of other oppressed nations which were also struggling for freedom, and this required solidarity amongst the different oppressed nations rather than one of them aggrandizing the others. Now, for all these reasons, therefore, we had a very different notion of nationalism. And what the current government is trying to do is to deliberately confuse people between the two notions of nationalism. When they say that if you say that there is oppression in Kashmir, you're being anti-national, that is invoking a notion of nationalism which was not in our freedom struggle. In fact, in our freedom struggle, the whole idea is that nobody in India should feel aggrieved. Therefore, if somebody says that people in Kashmir are aggrieved, that person is in fact in conformity with the concept of nationalism that underlay the anti-colonial struggle. We have to make sure that nobody in this country remains aggrieved or feels aggrieved. But if you say that saying that is anti-national, then you are substituting for the anti-colonial nationalism on the basis of which this country was formed by an aggrandizing European-style nationalism that sees some people as being superior compared to the other people. Now therefore, and likewise, if you see the nation is above the people, that what happens to the people, and if you speak the truth about the people, you are being anti-national, then you are saying the nation is above the people. If you say the nation is above the people, then naturally the question arises, then what is the nation? How do we know? How do we know what is national? And then all kinds of ideas can be thrown in. Pebbles can be put in people's minds that eating beef is anti-national, that not observing Karwa Chauth is anti-national, that not observing Bhagavati Jagaran is anti-national. In other words, once the nation has been defined as a metaphysical entity which is not synonymous with the interests of the people, then what the nation is escapes a rational discussion, escapes reasoned discourse. If you say that the nation really consists of the people, then I can say that yes, to the extent that the peasants don't commit suicide, we are strengthening the nation. That it is anti-national. It is an anti-national act on the part of government if it takes measures that encourage peasants to commit suicide. So then you know that there are certain clear markers in terms of which, by the application of reason, we can say that this is national, this is for the nation, this is against the nation. But if you say the nation is above the people, what it is we don't define because it is a metaphysical entity, then you can define it in any way. And therefore you can put pebbles in people's minds, you can put stones in people's minds and get them to conform to any notion of a nation, which you can then propagate through a controlled media, you can propagate through some kind of, you can propagate through all kinds of of stool pigeons, of fascist thugs, and so on. I should say that a lot of the student organization that was involved in a lot of the effort to attack the democratic space in the universities is an organization which is different from all other student organizations. I must say, I don't know how many of you know, the ABVP was not formed by, it's not the student wing of the BJP. It's not the student wing of the BJP like NSUI is the student wing of the Congress and so on. The ABVP was formed before the BJP was formed. It was formed even before the Jansangh was formed. It was formed directly by the RSS with the clear instruction of countering communist influence on the campuses in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So it's a very different kind of organization. It's not like a student organization like any other student organization. It's in fact an organization which is directly responsible to the RSS and whose job it was constructed, it was actually promoted in order to counter communist influence on the campuses, not to articulate student demands or any of that. Now, therefore, what you have now is that a false notion of nationalism, which has nothing to do with the anti-colonial struggle in India, is being propagated by those who themselves have nothing to do with the anti-colonial struggle. They are propagating a version of the aggrandizing European bourgeois nationalism against which the European left has been fighting all these years, and that is something which is now being given a respectability. Now, it's very important for students to actually draw this distinction, to know the kind of tricks which are being played, because Gandhiji's notion of nationalism and the notion of nationalism which actually says that if you say that there is oppression in Kashmir, you are being anti-national, are diametrically opposite to one another. Many of you may remember that Gandhiji, just before his assassination, had insisted that the Indian government must pay to Pakistan 55 crores of rupees, which by all due measures were due to Pakistan. And this was one of the factors which the RSS did not like, and it was one of the factors which was used against Gandhiji to create opinion, just prior to his assassination. That was the inclusive nationalism. My being Indian does not mean that I trample upon the rights of some other country. Therefore, it's very important for us, or some other people. My being Indian does not mean that one Indian is superior to another Indian, that if some other parts of India witness oppression, I remain quiet about it. I must not. And if I speak my mind and I'm called anti-national, then you are defining the nation very differently from the way that this nation was actually constituted and formed. Now, that is going to be a major danger to the education system in the coming years. I know that there has been a setback because of the JNU elections, in which one of our comrades on the dais was recently elected very handsomely. I congratulate her. But that is something which has come as a great source of hope for the democratic-minded people, because let's not forget that if the students in the most in a highly publicly funded, active institution in the country are sufficiently political to actually hand out a defeat to the ABVP of the kind that they gave out, then that means that things are good for our country. That's a very hopeful sign for the future. The second danger on which I want to say something is, of course, well known. It's something which comes from the commoditization of education which has been taking place. Now, the commoditization of education, you may say that, okay, what's wrong with private institutions? Harvard is a private institution in America, Princeton is a private institution, and so on. Columbia is a private institution. So what's wrong with private institutions? When we talk about commoditization of education in India, we are not just talking about private institutions. We have had private institutions for a long time. There are private philanthropic institutions and there are private profit-making institutions. These are two very different things. Somebody, some businessman, some rich man, some old Raja bequeaths money and says that I set up an endowment to start a university, fine, and that money grows and the university is set up. That is pure philanthropy. The objective there was not for the Raja or whoever set it up to make money. But there's a big difference between that and the kind of private institutions that we are now having in the country, which are basically institutions that are there to make money. When one says this, many people argue that, look, but this money is not being utilized by the businessman who set up the institution, but that's quite irrelevant. Just as, many would say that but this money is being used for investment in the institution itself, but that's completely irrelevant. Just as if you have retained profits of a firm being plowed back as investment in the firm, and that does not mean that the firm is not profit oriented. Likewise, if the money being made in a private education institution is plowed back as investment into that institution, that does not mean that it is not profit oriented. The whole objective is profit orientation. Now you may say that, okay, but what is wrong with profit oriented institutions? All right, they may not be the same as philanthropic institutions. They may be interested in making money, but they are filling a gap after all. They are giving training, so what's wrong with it? There are a number of things seriously wrong with it, and we need to really be aware of them. The first thing which is obviously wrong with them is that they exclude large numbers of people. Obviously, the fees are very high, as was mentioned by the comrade before me, and if the fees are very high, then that excludes many. I said that one of the great things about the publicly funded institutions in India has been that it has actually involved many people from deprived and oppressed backgrounds to come to the centers of education, and it has actually thrown up intellectuals from those segments who then articulate much better than anybody else the kind of feelings and passions and injustices that they have been subjected to. But the point is that a money-making institution necessarily excludes such people. When this argument is made, many people like the Planning Commission and so on used to, the old Planning Commission used to argue, but no, the students can always live on student loans. That it may be the fees are very high, but so what? Because the students can always take loans, meet these high fees, and when they get their jobs, later on, they can pay back these loans. Now, if it was the case that somebody could absolutely ensure that all students who pass out of these institutions would get jobs which are sufficiently paying to be able to pay back the loan, then one could even listen to that argument. That's not the case. And if that's not the case, then loan-funded education would give rise to student suicides the same way that loan-funded agricultural activities have actually given rise to a spate of peasant suicides. And the point is, this very fact is something that would weigh on the minds of many who are excluded from this institution. They won't even take loans. How can I take a loan to finance my education, paying huge amounts if I don't know at the end of it I'm going to get a job or not? And if I don't, then of course whatever little I have or my parents have would simply be lost to them, will become destitute. So the point is that this exclusion is certain. And of course, if this exclusion is certain, then one very important consequence of this exclusion is that this intellectuals coming from the oppressed segments would no longer be coming. And that also implies that the kind of sensitivity among the non-oppressed students that proximity to the oppressed students generated, that also would be missing. In any case, the commoditization of anything, not just education, really implies one very important thing. There is a misconception you often find that if something is sold in the market, it's a commodity. Well, that's not true, by the way. A product does not just become a commodity if it is sold in the market. A commodity has a very specific characteristic. A commodity has this characteristic that it is for the seller of the commodity, not a use value, but a pure exchange value. A product becomes a commodity only when, for the seller on the market, it is no longer a use value but pure exchange value. That means for the seller on the market, it is pure money. The owner of Walmart doesn't consume the goods from the Walmart, or it's not as if Walmart doesn't sell, so it goes to the house of the seller, which can well happen with the village halwai. But on the other hand, that does not happen when you have authentic, genuine commodity production. Commodity production, therefore, means that for the seller, what is being sold is pure money. Now, if the universities, the students who come into the university system, for them education is an input, and of course they look upon education as a means of themselves becoming commodities on the market. Therefore, for them, education itself takes the essence of education becomes how much money can it fetch me on the market. If there's a paying course, if a course can get me a better job, then of course I go there. I'm not saying that everywhere in India this has happened, but you would be surprised to know that when I was a student in Delhi University, the brightest students used to do physics. These days, I'm told, the brightest students do commerce. Now, I'm nothing against commerce, but why should suddenly the brightest students start doing commerce? Not because commerce has suddenly become intellectually more exciting or challenging than physics, but because it entitles you to get a better job. So the point is then, for those into whom education is going, who are the embodiments of education, who imbibe education, for them itself, education in a system where there is commoditization of education becomes really a means of getting a larger amount of money. Courses are compared on the basis of what kind of a job it will fetch you, etc. Now that has a number of implications. The first implication is that social sensitivity is something that becomes irrelevant, because I have no time, I have no concern for using my education to acquire any social sensitivity. I'm just using the education in order to make myself into a better earner on the market. So the education system, as I was saying earlier, produces essentially self-centered, self-absorbed, self-interested individuals. That's the ultimate aim of the education system. I'm by no means saying that everybody who comes from a private university is like this, but that is the limit point, that is the objective, that's the direction of this education system. The second thing which it implies is that if that is what education is and the way it is looked at, in that case, even the grandeur of ideas, one of the most exciting things about education is simply the beauty and the grandeur of ideas to which one is being introduced. The grandeur of ideas gets lost because, after all, if you are simply taking ideas only as a means of regurgitating them in the examinations to get a better mark, to get a better job, basically your objective therefore is to get a bit of money, then the grandeur of ideas, the whole idea of questioning is something that goes by the wayside. A commodity is better, it's more lovely if it's nicely packaged. If it's nicely packaged, if it's very neatly done, then so much the better. It's essentially a closed thing. Now, education, to be worthwhile, must make you ask questions. Asking questions opens up things. And as a result, education as a commodity is fundamentally against the idea of your asking any question. The idea is to give you some capsules which you consume and or you kind of imbibe and you regurgitate at the time of exams. The nicer the capsule, the better is the education system supposed to be, and it is judged on the basis of how well you have regurgitated those capsules in your examination. Now, I must say the other feature, therefore, is, of course, with the going of the social sensitivity, the whole thrust of the education system becomes different. Let me just explain this a bit, because, there's a lot of confusion on this. If the idea is that if education is to produce socially sensitive individuals who raise questions, what does it mean? I like using a concept which Antonio Gramsci had used, namely he had talked of a concept of organic intellectuals. I believe the purpose of education system in countries like India must be to produce organic intellectuals of the people. All countries which have been formed on the basis of anti-colonial struggles, on the basis of people's movements, the purpose of the education system in such a country must be to produce organic intellectuals of the people who would in fact be concerned with the people's interest, who would be concerned with the preservation of democracy, which empowers people, who would be concerned with the freedom of the people against imperialist encroachments. In short, they must be equipped with ideas so that they can perform this particular role.